The viewport showed 10,000 stars, and Thomas Reed couldn't focus on any of them. His reflection stared back from the transparent alloy, a tired man with rumpled shirt sleeves and hair that had given up any pretense of professional styling somewhere around hour 6 of today's negotiations. Behind him, the quarters assigned to Earth's envoy hummed with the subtle vibrations of a living ship. Because, of course, the Valkyrie built their vessels from bioengineered materials that breathed and adjusted and probably judged him for his inadequacies. 3 weeks aboard the Eternal Radiance, and Thomas still couldn't shake the feeling that the ship disapproved of his presence. He turned from the window, rubbing his eyes with the heels of his hands. The day's session had gone poorly, worse than poorly. The Valkyrie High Council had listened to his carefully prepared arguments for establishing trade routes through their space, with the enthusiasm of statues watching paint dry. And Queen Merlin, who sat at the center of their semicircle like a living embodiment of ancient authority, had maintained that same impenetrable expression she'd worn since the first day he'd arrived. Thomas moved to the small desk where his notes lay scattered in organized chaos. Cultural liaison, they'd called him, linguistic specialist, the man who understood alien perspectives better than traditional diplomats with their rigid protocols. What they'd really meant was, we're sending someone expendable who might accidentally stumble into success because he doesn't know enough to follow the rules. He picked up one of his data tablets, scrolling through his observations about Valkyrie body language. The ears were key, those long, elegant points that rose from Merlin's silver hair and marked her species' only visible difference from baseline human. When pleased, they tilted forward slightly. When displeased, they flattened. During today's session, hers had been so flat against her skull he'd wondered if they could actually merge with her head. "Day 21, he muttered, opening a voice log. "The Queen hates us. The Council hates us. I'm pretty sure even the ship hates us. Earth's colonies are running low on essential resources. We desperately need access to the Krishna trading lanes that pass through Valkyrie space, and I'm no closer to an agreement than when I arrived. Recommendation: send someone who actually knows what they're doing." He stopped recording and tossed the tablet back onto the desk. Who was he kidding? There was no one else. Earth had exactly 3 people with advanced xenolinguistic training, and the other 2 were committed to ongoing negotiations with species that actually liked humanity. Thomas had drawn the short straw, the Valkyrie, who viewed humans as interesting curiosities at best and potential nuisances at worst. The quarters were spacious by human standards, which meant they were probably considered cramped by Valkyrie standards. The walls shifted through subtle color gradients in response to the ship's day-night cycle, currently settling into deep blues and purples that suggested evening. The bed was larger than anything Thomas had owned on Earth, its surface responding to body heat and pressure in ways that made sleeping feel like floating in warm water. He'd initially found it unsettling, but 3 weeks of exhaustion had overcome his discomfort. He stripped off his jacket, the formal attire Earth had insisted he wear to convey professionalism. The Valkyrie wore armor as casual wear, and robes woven from materials that made silk look like burlap. His polyester blend probably impressed no one. Thomas caught his reflection in the darkened viewport again. 32 years old, already graying at the temples from stress, with the kind of face his mother had called pleasantly average. Not the commanding presence of a master negotiator, not the intimidating bearing of a political power player. Just a linguist who'd spent most of his career studying dead languages, and now found himself trying to convince an empire that had existed for 40,000 years that humanity was worth paying attention to. The absurdity hit him fresh, and he laughed, a short, bitter sound that the room absorbed without echo. Movement caught his eye in the viewport's reflection. The door mechanism was activating. Thomas turned, expecting a service drone delivering the evening meal he hadn't requested. The Valkyrie were punctual about sustenance schedules, even for guests who had no appetite. The door slid open with a whisper of displaced air. Merlin stood in the corridor. Thomas's brain stuttered trying to process the image. The Queen, who he'd last seen 3 hours ago in the council chamber, surrounded by advisors and guards, draped in ceremonial armor that seemed to be part metal and part liquid light. The Queen, who had looked at him with the emotional warmth of a glacier evaluating an ice cube. That Queen was not the person standing in his doorway. Merlin wore simple sleeping robes, pale blue fabric that moved like water, completely unlike her usual formal attire. Her silver hair, normally bound in elaborate styles that probably took hours to arrange, fell loose around her shoulders. Those long ears, which had been flat with displeasure during negotiations, were tilted in an expression Thomas had never seen, something between uncertainty and exhaustion. And she was alone. No guards, no attendants, no advisors hovering with data tablets and whispered counsel, just her, standing in his doorway, looking more human than he'd ever seen her despite the ears that marked her as anything but. "Your Majesty," Thomas managed, his voice rough. He reached for his jacket, some automatic protocol response kicking in, but stopped. She'd seen him disheveled. Adding a jacket wouldn't restore dignity that was already lost. Merlin didn't speak immediately. She studied him with those ancient eyes, pale gold like captured sunlight, holding knowledge Thomas couldn't begin to comprehend. A queen who had ruled for over a century, who carried genetic memories of her predecessors, who commanded fleets that could sterilize planets. She looked terrified. "Ambassador Reed," she said quietly, her voice missing all its usual commanding resonance. The translator in Thomas's ear rendered her words with only slight lag, but he caught the underlying harmonics of her actual speech, the musical quality that no human throat could reproduce. "May I?" She stopped, her ears flattening briefly before rising again. "May I come in?" Thomas stepped back automatically, gesturing to the room. "Of course, please." She entered, and the door sealed behind her with a soft hiss. The room's ambient lighting adjusted slightly, warming in response to a second presence. Merlin stood in the center of his quarters, looking suddenly lost, and Thomas realized he had absolutely no protocol for this situation. The Queen of the Velkari Empire, alone in his room after dark, wearing sleeping clothes. "Can I?" Thomas stopped, unsure what he was even offering. "Would you like to sit?" He gestured to the single chair near his desk. Merlin looked at it, then at him, and something flickered across her face that might have been amusement or sadness or both. "I find myself," she said slowly, each word carefully chosen, "in need of something I have no right to ask for." Thomas waited, his heart hammering. Diplomatic incident, his brain screamed. Political catastrophe. International crisis waiting to happen. Merlin's hands twisted in the fabric of her robes, a gesture so at odds with her usual perfect composure that Thomas felt something crack in his chest. "May I sleep beside you tonight, human?" The question hung in the air between them, impossibly heavy, impossibly fragile. And Thomas realized that the Queen of the Velkari Empire hadn't issued a command. She had made a plea. Thomas's mouth opened, but no sound emerged. His brain, which had spent 3 weeks processing complex xenolinguistic patterns and navigating diplomatic nuances, had apparently chosen this moment to completely shut down. The Queen of the Velkari Empire stood in his quarters asking to sleep beside him, and every possible response felt simultaneously inadequate and catastrophic. He started, then stopped. "Your Majesty, I'm not sure I understand." Merlin's ears flattened slightly and she looked away, focusing on the viewport where stars streaked past in the ship's faster-than-light transit. "I should not have come. This was inappropriate. Please forget I—" "No, wait," Thomas said quickly, moving half a step forward before catching himself. "I'm not saying no. I'm just trying to understand what you're asking. Because the words suggest one thing, but context suggests another. And I'd really rather not accidentally cause a diplomatic incident through misinterpretation." Something that might have been a smile touched Merlin's lips. "You sound like a linguist." "I am a linguist. It's literally my only qualification for being here." Thomas gestured to the chair again, more firmly this time. "Please sit, or I'll sit. Or we'll both stand awkwardly until someone explains what's happening." Merlin moved to the chair and settled into it with the fluid grace he'd come to associate with her species. Thomas sat on the edge of his bed, maintaining what he hoped was respectful distance, while also positioning himself below her eye level, something his briefing materials had suggested conveyed deference in Velkari culture. "I have not slept," Merlin said quietly, staring at her hands, "in 4 years." Thomas blinked. "I'm sorry, what?" "Not truly slept. I have rested, entered meditation states, allowed my body the minimum recovery required. But sleep, actual sleep, where consciousness fades and one becomes vulnerable, I have not experienced that in 4 years." Her ears twitched. Before that it had been 6 years, and before that 9. "That seems medically concerning," Thomas said carefully. "It is psychologically necessary." Merlin looked up at him, and the exhaustion in her eyes was suddenly visible, carved into her expression like scars. "Do you know what it means to rule an empire for 117 years? Ambassador Reed. I can barely handle organizing my own apartment, so no." That almost smile again. "It means you are never alone. Never truly. Even in my private chambers there are guards outside, advisors on call, sensors monitoring for threats. Every moment is observed, recorded, analyzed for weakness or opportunity. And when you carry the genetic memories of 43 predecessors, even your own thoughts are crowded." Thomas felt something shift in his understanding. "You came here because this is the only place you might actually be alone. You are perceptive." Merlin's hand stilled in her lap. "My quarters are in the ship's heart, surrounded by security protocols and attendants who would notice immediately if I attempted rest without proper safeguards. But you are a guest, assigned to this isolated section of the ship. Your quarters have minimal monitoring out of diplomatic courtesy, and you—" She paused, her ears tilting forward slightly. "You have never looked at me the way others do." "How do others look at you?" "With worship, with fear, with calculation." She met his eyes directly. "You look at me as if I am a person who occasionally says interesting things and sometimes makes you nervous. It is the most honest interaction I have experienced in longer than I can measure." Thomas processed this, his mind racing through implications. "So when you ask to sleep beside me, you mean literally sleep, just rest, in the presence of someone who won't try to kill you or worship you, or use the moment against you politically." "Yes." The word came out almost as a sigh, "though I understand if the request is too strange, too inappropriate. I have no right to ask this of you. You owe me nothing, and I am placing you in a position that could be misinterpreted or—" "Yes," Thomas said. Merlin stopped mid-sentence. "Yes. Yes, you can stay. If it helps you sleep, actually sleep, then yes." Thomas ran a hand through his hair, realizing how insane this was and not caring. "Though I should probably warn you that I snore sometimes, and I have no idea if Velkari find that disturbing or—" "Thank you." Merlin's voice was so quiet he almost missed it. They sat in silence for a moment, the absurdity of the situation settling around them like fog. The queen of an ancient empire and a human linguist who'd been chosen because he was expendable, about to share sleeping space because loneliness transcended species boundaries. "For what it's worth," Thomas said, "I haven't slept well since arriving either. Different reasons, obviously. Mostly stress about failing and dooming humanity to eternal irrelevance in galactic politics. But the insomnia is real." "You have not failed," Merlin said. "Your arguments have been sound, your research thorough. The Council's resistance is not about your inadequacy." "Then what's it about?" "Fear." She looked at him directly. "Humanity is chaos embodied. You are young, aggressive, unpredictable. Everything about your species suggests instability. My council has watched 3 civilizations collapse in the past 1,000 years from making alliances with unstable partners. They will not risk the Velkari repeating that pattern. So we're doomed regardless of what I say. I did not say that. Merlin's expression shifted, something calculating entering it. I said the council fears. I have not yet decided what I believe. Thomas studied her, seeing the complexity beneath the exhausted queen. You're the one really making this decision, aren't you? The council is advisory, but your word is final. In matters of external alliance, yes, though going against their unified recommendation would create internal complications I would prefer to avoid. She tilted her head slightly, ears adjusting. Tell me honestly, Thomas Reed. Why should I trust humanity? The use of his first name didn't escape his notice. Honestly, I don't know. We're a mess. We fight among ourselves, we make terrible decisions, we rush into things without thinking, but we also persist. We adapt. We refuse to give up even when the universe makes it clear we're out of our depth. He paused. Plus, we're occasionally funny. That has to count for something. Merlin's laugh surprised them both, a musical sound that the translator couldn't quite capture. Occasionally funny. I will add that to my list of criteria for alliance. See, already showing better judgment than the council. That is a dangerously low bar. She stood slowly, exhaustion evident in the movement. The ship's night cycle is deepening. If your offer remains genuine, I should accept before my absence is noticed. Thomas rose as well, suddenly aware of the practical implications. The bed was large, but it was still a bed. Designed for sleeping, yes, but also an inherently intimate space. He pushed the thought aside. This was about need, not politics or anything else. The offer stands, he said. Though I should probably warn you, I have no idea what sleeping arrangements work for Velkari comfort. If there's something I need to adjust or... Just rest, Thomas. Merlin moved toward the bed with the same uncertainty she'd shown entering the room. That is all I seek, the simple presence of someone who will not judge me for vulnerability. That I can definitely do, Thomas said. Vulnerability is kind of my default state these days. She smiled at that, a real smile that made her look younger despite the century-plus she carried. Perhaps that is why I find you trustworthy. You admit weakness where others project false strength. They navigated the logistics awkwardly, Thomas offering her the side closer to the viewport, making sure the temperature controls were accessible, explaining how the bed's surface would adjust to her presence. Practical details that filled the space where uncertainty lived. When they finally settled, lying beside each other in the dimness of the ship's night cycle, Thomas was acutely aware of the strangeness and rightness of the moment in equal measure. Thomas, Merlin's voice came softly in the darkness. Yeah. Thank you for not making this complicated. Trust me, my brain is making it plenty complicated. I'm just choosing not to share that part. Another small laugh. Honest and amusing. Humanity may have more merit than my council suspects. Don't base your entire assessment of humanity on me. We're much worse as a species than I am individually. Noted. Silence settled, broken only by the ship's subtle humming and the distant sounds of a vast vessel moving through impossible space. Thomas stared at the ceiling, wondering if this moment would be remembered as the beginning of something significant or just a footnote in his inevitable failure. Beside him, Merlin's breathing began to slow, deepening into patterns that suggested actual sleep was approaching. And Thomas felt something unexpected. Hope. The bed adjusted beneath them with subtle intelligence, creating optimal support for 2 different physiologies. Thomas lay perfectly still, hyper-aware of every breath, every slight movement. Beside him, Merlin had closed her eyes but hadn't fully relaxed, her shoulders still carrying the tension of someone unaccustomed to genuine rest. You can breathe normally, she said without opening her eyes. I can hear you trying not to. Sorry. I'm just very aware that this is possibly the strangest thing I've ever done, and I once accidentally attended a Thanari mating ritual thinking it was a business luncheon. Merlin's eyes opened, amusement flickering in those golden depths. Tell me about that. The ritual or the existential horror of realizing my mistake? Both. Thomas shifted slightly, settling more comfortably as the absurdity of his situation continued to crystallize. I was doing my doctoral research on the Nari verb conjugations, which change based on reproductive status. I'd been corresponding with a cultural liaison who invited me to a gathering to discuss linguistics. What he failed to mention was that discussing linguistics was their euphemism for public reproduction ceremonies. What did you do? Sat through the entire thing with a frozen smile, took detailed notes, and later submitted a paper on the morphological complexity of arousal-based phoneme shifts. My advisor said it was the most academically rigorous description of alien reproduction she'd ever read. Thomas paused. I was also banned from 3 Thenari colony worlds for being a pervert. Merlin laughed, not the small, controlled sound from before, but something genuine that made her whole body shake slightly. The movement seemed to surprise her, as if she'd forgotten what unguarded laughter felt like. So by comparison, Thomas continued, lying here fully clothed beside a queen who needs sleep is relatively normal. Barely makes my top 10 weird situations. I find your definition of normal highly questionable. But Merlin's shoulders had lowered slightly, tension easing. Tell me more about your research, before you became humanity's desperate representative. Desperate seems harsh but accurate. Thomas laced his fingers behind his head, staring at the ceiling where bioluminescent patterns moved in slow waves. I study dead languages, civilizations that collapsed, species that went extinct, leaving behind only fragments of communication. I was trying to understand what linguistic patterns might predict societal decline. Dark subject matter for someone so young. I'm 32. That's not particularly young by human standards. I have ceremonial robes older than you. Merlin said it without condescension, just stating fact. Continue. Right. Well, I found that languages tend to calcify before civilizations collapse. They become rigid, formal, unable to accommodate new concepts. Communication becomes ritual rather than exchange. Thomas glanced at her. Your court speaks in very formal patterns. You think we are calcifying. I think you're stable, but stability and stagnation can look identical from certain angles. Merlin was quiet for a moment, processing. The genetic memories I carry show me the Velkari language of 10,000 years ago. It is nearly identical to how we speak now. We consider this proof of our perfection, or evidence that you stopped evolving. You are bold to insult my people while lying beside their queen. You asked for honesty. I'm just terrible at providing the polite version. Thomas paused, though if it helps, humans have the opposite problem. Our languages mutate so quickly that recordings from 2 centuries ago sound alien to us. We can't maintain stability long enough to build anything lasting. Balance would be ideal. Balance is always ideal. Actually achieving it is the hard part. They fell into comfortable silence, and Thomas felt Merlin's breathing continue to deepen beside him. But just as he thought she might be drifting toward actual sleep, she spoke again. The genetic memories are both gift and burden, she said quietly. I can access the experiences of every queen before me, their knowledge, their mistakes, their emotions. It provides continuity, wisdom spanning millennia. Her voice dropped. It also means I am never alone in my own mind. Even in this moment, I feel them present, observing, judging. 43 voices whispering that this is inappropriate, dangerous, weak. What does your voice say? Merlin turned her head to look at him, their faces closer than he'd realized in the dimness. My voice says I am exhausted, that I have carried their weight for over a century and deserve one night of being simply myself. Then tell the ancestors to shut up and let you sleep. One does not tell ancient queens to shut up. I just told you to shut up about ancient queens, so apparently one does. Thomas softened his tone. Look, I obviously don't understand what it's like carrying all those memories, but you're here now in this moment and they're not. This is your life, not theirs. If they have a problem with you taking care of yourself, they can submit a formal complaint from beyond the grave. Merlin stared at him for a long moment, then laughed again, that genuine sound that seemed to surprise her each time. You are utterly irreverent. It's one of my few consistent qualities. I find it, she paused considering, refreshing. My people treat history with such reverence that we forget we are creating it in real time. Your perspective is different, chaotic and disrespectful. Human, she said it like it might be a compliment. Thomas felt something shift between them, the strangeness of the situation transforming into something more grounded. They were just two beings, fundamentally alone in the universe, finding unexpected common ground in darkness. Can I ask you something? Thomas ventured. You may. Why me? I mean specifically. If you needed someone who wouldn't treat you like a queen, surely there are others aboard this ship. Crew members, scientists, someone you've known longer than 3 weeks. Merlin's ears tilted in that thoughtful expression he was learning to read. Because you saw me make a mistake. I don't remember that. Second day of negotiations. I was presenting the historical precedent for Velkari territorial boundaries, and I referenced the Treaty of Carnchal. Her voice held something like embarrassment, except I said Carnchal, a minor pronunciation error, meaningless to everyone present. I remember, Thomas said slowly. You corrected yourself immediately. Yes, and do you remember how others reacted? Thomas thought back. They pretended it hadn't happened. The council members all maintained perfect composure, like they hadn't heard the slip. Exactly. They preserved my dignity by denying my humanity, my personhood. The error became invisible because acknowledging it would suggest I am fallible. Merlin's golden eyes held his. But you smiled, just briefly, sympathetically, as one person does when another makes a harmless mistake. You acknowledged it without judgment, then moved on. In that moment, you treated me as a peer who had stumbled slightly, not as a deity who must be perfect. I didn't realize that meant anything. It meant everything. It was the first honest interaction I have had in years. Thomas processed this, understanding clicking into place. So you came here because I'm the only person aboard this massive warship who treats you like a regular person who occasionally mispronounces words. Essentially, yes. That's incredibly sad. That's incredibly true. Merlin closed her eyes again. I am surrounded by thousands of beings and I am utterly alone, until tonight. Thomas felt the weight of that confession settle over them. The ship hummed around them, carrying its queen and its uncertain human guest through the void, and for this moment they were the only two souls in existence who mattered. For what it's worth, he said quietly, I think Carnchal is easier to pronounce anyway. The Velkari need better vowel placement in their treaty names. I will inform the Historical Council immediately. See, already making important changes to Velkari civilization. Merlin's laugh was softer this time, fading into something like contentment. Her breathing deepened again, and this time her body truly relaxed, the century of tension beginning to drain away. Thomas felt her hand move across the space between them, settling near his without quite touching, close enough to sense presence without presuming intimacy. He shifted slightly, letting his fingers rest near hers, and felt the warmth of her skin against his. Thomas, her voice was barely audible now, sleep finally pulling her under. Yeah. Thank you for seeing me. Before he could respond, her breathing shifted into the deep, rhythmic pattern of genuine sleep. For the first time in 4 years, the queen of the Velkari Empire rested without guards, without advisors, without the weight of millennia pressing down on her consciousness. And Thomas Reed, expendable linguist and humanity's unlikely representative, lay beside her in the darkness and understood that something profound had just occurred. Tomorrow would bring complications, questions, potential consequences neither of them could predict. But tonight, For these precious hours, they had managed something simple and revolutionary. Two beings from different worlds had found comfort in each other's presence, building a bridge across the void, one quiet moment at a time. Thomas's own eyes grew heavy, exhaustion finally claiming him as well. His last conscious thought was that if humanity's best chance at alliance rested on accidentally befriending a lonely queen, they were either incredibly lucky or completely doomed. Possibly both. Thomas woke to soft amber light filtering through the viewport and the immediate disorienting awareness that he wasn't alone. Memory crashed back, the queen, her request, the surreal night of conversation and companionable silence. He turned his head carefully and found Merlin still asleep beside him, her silver hair spread across the pillow like spilled moonlight. She looked different in sleep, younger somehow, despite carrying a century-plus of life. The constant vigilance that normally armored her expression had dissolved, leaving something vulnerable and almost heartbreakingly human. Her ears, which usually stayed alert and mobile, lay relaxed against her head, and her breathing remained deep and even. Thomas very carefully did not move. He had no idea what protocol governed waking up beside alien royalty who had sought refuge in your quarters. His diplomatic training certainly hadn't covered it, and his common sense was suggesting several contradictory approaches simultaneously. Stay still, leave quietly, wait for her to wake naturally. The decision was made for him when Merlin's eyes opened, focusing immediately with the clarity of someone accustomed to instant alertness. For a moment they simply looked at each other, and Thomas watched awareness return to her expression, where she was, who she was with, what had occurred. "Good morning," he ventured. "Or whatever passes for morning on a ship that doesn't technically experience planetary rotation." Merlin's lips curved slightly. "Morning is a psychological construct we maintain for crew sanity. Technically irrelevant but functionally necessary." She sat up slowly, and Thomas noticed the transformation already beginning, the queen reassembling herself from the vulnerable person who had sought sleep. "How long was I unconscious?" "I'm not sure. I fell asleep too." Thomas checked the chronometer on his data tablet. "Looks like about 6 hours, which is the most I've slept since boarding this ship." 6 hours. Merlin repeated it with something like wonder. "I do not remember the last time I rested that long without interruption. Happy to provide unconsciousness facilitation services." Thomas sat up as well, running a hand through his hopelessly disheveled hair. "Though I should probably warn you that this is going to look incredibly suspicious to anyone monitoring your movements. My movements are not monitored within the ship. That would suggest distrust of my judgment." Merlin straightened her sleeping robes with unconscious dignity. "Though my absence from my quarters will have been noted by now, questions will be asked." "What will you tell them?" "The truth after a fashion. That I was evaluating humanity's representative through extended observation." Her golden eyes met his with calculation. "It is not entirely inaccurate." Thomas felt the diplomatic implications crystallizing. "So this becomes part of the assessment. Not a moment of vulnerability, but a strategic observation period." "Does that bother you?" "Should it?" Thomas stood, moving to the viewport where stars stretched past in faster-than-light patterns. "I'm here to convince you that humanity deserves a chance. If spending the night talking with you helps that goal, then I'm not going to complain about the methodology, even if it reduces an honest moment to political calculation." "Welcome to diplomacy. Everything is political calculation dressed up as honest moments." He glanced back at her. "Though for what it's worth, I don't think what happened here was calculated by either of us. You needed rest. I provided a safe space. The fact that it might influence your decision is a side effect, not the purpose." Merlin stood as well, and Thomas noticed how the morning light caught her features differently, highlighting the subtle differences from baseline human. The slight luminescence to her skin, the way her eyes reflected light in patterns human eyes couldn't achieve, the elegant length of those ears that had become oddly endearing over the past weeks. You are perceptive, Thomas Reed. She moved toward the door, then paused. Today's council session will be challenging. My advisors will push for immediate rejection of your petition. They have scheduled testimonies from 3 civilizations that attempted alliance with unstable species and suffered consequences. So they're going for maximum drama. Great. I will be expected to make a preliminary decision by end of session. Merlin's expression was unreadable. The final vote will not occur for another week, but my position will heavily influence the council's direction. Thomas felt his stomach tighten. This was it, 3 weeks of negotiation coming down to whatever happened in today's session. Any advice for surviving the firing squad? Do not apologize for what humanity is. My council expects deference and attempts to minimize your species' chaotic nature. Surprise them instead. Embrace it. Make them see that what they fear might be exactly what the Velkhari need. That seems like a terrible strategy. Perhaps, she smiled slightly, or perhaps it is the only strategy that has any chance of success. The door opened at her approach, and Merlin paused in the threshold, looking back at him. For a moment the queen dissolved again, and he saw just a person who had found something unexpected and didn't quite want to leave it behind. Will you? Thomas started, then stopped. Is this going to happen again? Do you want it to? I'm not sure wanting is relevant here. You needed something last night. If you need it again, the offer stands. No politics, no implications, just rest. Merlin studied him for a long moment. You would grant sanctuary to the being who holds your species' fate in her hands, expecting nothing in return. I would grant sanctuary to someone who couldn't sleep and needed a safe place. The fact that she's queen is honestly kind of incidental. Incidental? Merlin's laugh was soft. No one has ever considered my position incidental. First time for everything. She left then, disappearing into the corridor beyond, and Thomas stood in the sudden silence of his quarters feeling like he just experienced something significant without fully understanding its shape. The day's session began 3 hours later, and Thomas walked into the council chamber with the same dread he'd carried for 3 weeks. The semicircle of Velkhari nobles and allied species representatives waited like a tribunal, their collective attention weighing on him with physical force. But Merlin sat at the center, elevated on her throne of living metal, and when their eyes met briefly, he saw something there that hadn't existed before. Interest. Genuine, engaged curiosity. The session proceeded as she'd warned. Testimony after testimony about failed alliances, about chaotic species that had brought ruin to stable empires, about the dangers of trusting the unpredictable. Thomas listened to himself and his entire species being categorized as existential threats, and felt the old fear rising that he'd come all this way to fail anyway. Then Merlin spoke. The council's concerns are noted and valid based on historical precedent. However, history also shows us that stagnation leads to eventual collapse, and the Velkhari Empire has achieved stable perfection at the cost of adaptation. Her voice carried absolute authority. Ambassador Reed addressed the council directly. Do not soften humanity's nature. Tell us why we should embrace chaos rather than fear it. Thomas stood, his heart hammering, and understood what she was doing, giving him the opening to be honest rather than diplomatic. He took a breath and dove in. Humanity is a mess, he said bluntly. We fight with each other, we make terrible decisions, we're impulsive and irrational, and we've nearly destroyed ourselves at least a dozen times in our brief history. If you're looking for stability and predictability, we're the wrong choice. We're going to disappoint you, surprise you, and probably make you regret taking a chance on us. The council members' expressions ranged from shock to vindication. Thomas pushed forward. But here's what we're also good at: adapting, surviving, finding new solutions when old ones fail. We're only 300 years into space exploration, and we've already established colonies in 12 systems. We've made first contact with 17 species and only started wars with 3 of them. which honestly is better than our projections. We're learning. Learning is insufficient, one of the Velkari nobles interjected. You are children playing with technology you barely understand. Exactly, Thomas agreed. We're children, and children grow, they change. They become something different than what they started as. Your civilization has been the same for 10,000 years. That's stability. But it's also vulnerability. Because when something finally does challenge you, and something always does eventually, you won't know how to change. You propose we risk alliance to learn flexibility from humans. Another council member, skeptical. I propose you risk alliance because humanity represents something your empire has forgotten: potential. We're not perfect. We're barely competent most days, but we're trying, we're growing, and we refuse to give up even when we probably should. Thomas looked at Merlin. Sometimes the biggest risk is playing it safe. The chamber fell silent. Thomas could see calculation happening behind a dozen sets of alien eyes, could feel the weight of judgment settling over his words. Merlin stood, and the room's attention shifted to her immediately. The council will adjourn for deliberation. Ambassador Reed, remain available for additional questions. A preliminary decision will be announced before the day's end. It was dismissal, formal and absolute. Thomas bowed and left, his heart still racing, unsure if he just secured humanity's future or guaranteed its isolation. Hours later, as artificial evening settled over the ship, his door chimed. Thomas opened it to find Merlin standing there again, still in her formal armor but with that same exhaustion beginning to show around her eyes. "May I?" she asked simply. "Always," Thomas replied. She entered, and this time there was no hesitation as she moved to the bed they'd shared the previous night. Thomas settled beside her, and she spoke quietly into the darkness. "I told the council I will support your petition. Not because of last night, though that did influence my understanding, but because you showed me today what I had already begun to suspect. Humanity's chaos is not a flaw, it is a feature. And the Velkari need to remember what growth looks like before we calcify completely. Did they accept that? They will. My word carries weight, and I reminded them that every great advancement in our history came from embracing calculated risk." She turned to look at him, though I did not tell them about this. "About what?" "About finding someone who sees past the crown to the person beneath. About discovering that the most valuable diplomatic exchange might be simply being honest with another being." Her hand found his in the darkness. "About needing rest and finding it in the most unexpected place." Thomas squeezed her hand gently. "The offer stands, remember. No politics, just rest. I may take you up on that more than is professionally advisable. Lucky for both of us, I'm terrible at professional advice." Merlin's laugh was soft and genuine, and as she settled into sleep beside him for the second night, Thomas understood that what they'd built here was fragile and strange and potentially transformative. Humanity